York, you have been a hands-on executive and co-founder working at the intersection of blockchain, AI, and broader Microsoft level products. How has working across both centralized enterprise environments and decentralized systems shaped how you think about security risk and trust models in blockchain native applications?
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting problem and intersection that a lot of people grapple with because large centralized infrastructure obviously gives you scale, that we see from all the cloud providers. That comes with certain risks that, when you're like a purist in security, you look at things like censorship resistance, attack surfaces, single party control, right? Those are not necessarily like all of the some of those things are actually what a security team would look at, right, from a cybersecurity perspective. But infrastructure designers who are building cloud-based systems and have learned over 20, 15, 20 years, whatever, how many decades they've been doing this work, don't assume the same things, right, that you assume when you're coming from a vulnerable open source internet environment and trying to stand up cryptographically secured infrastructure, right, for sort of common usage across parties, right? It's just a very, very different paradigm. And so I think I would say that's the biggest challenge is that as almost any new enterprise or new provider jumps in, their trust assumptions are fundamentally different than those that are required really to have distributed consensus, essentially, and trust in open, secure infrastructure, right? And so I would say that's just conceptually the biggest hurdle. And that sort of leads into another challenge, which is, AI is massively powerful. And the massive power of AI, I think, leads people to believe that it can be an augmentation of their knowledge and skills, which is true. But like the things that don't exist in that are the gaps that will lead you down a road of like, here's a solution, here's how I scale it, right? Here's what I need to worry about and what I don't need to worry about. And if you're not drawing on the right resources, you're not going to get the answer that actually gives you a secure consensus-based distributed system.
Given your leadership experience in blockchain and your enthusiasm around AI and Web3, what are some of the unique security risks that you see emerging, especially when these two domains converge? So, for instance, things like smart contract automation with AI or secure Oracle feeds, AI-assisted governance, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of areas that I would highlight there. One is when you inject AI as a helper into your system, whether it's Web3 or not, you want to open up secure access to assets, right? Because they're proprietary to your work or proprietary to your organization's work. And that actually helps you be more productive, right? Whether that's your calendar, contacts, and email, or whether it's all the files that are sitting on your shared drives, right? Whatever form of those shared drives are for your team. But that is also all of your proprietary data, right? About your work. And so that works in the context of a very secure enterprise type of permission base, right? And this is something that we saw actually, which was fundamentally different between using Copilot, which was designed by an enterprise company who actually grounds its entire tech suite on top of a RBAC permissioning system so that you can actually secure all those assets, right? And is very, very thoughtful about security as well, again, within the context of a centralized provider. And if you look at the different architectures and the challenges that non-enterprise systems that started up like OpenAI and Anthropic and other AI tooling is sort of sitting outside of the enterprise permission. And so there was a opportunity that Microsoft's Copilot had, which was it was already bolted into the enterprise security. And so it could get a real head start, right, on opening up the opportunity for productivity through AI with existing proprietary assets, whereas the others had to figure out how do I actually enable that, unlock it, And how do I think about it in the context of what's being trained in terms of the AI model? Where does the AI model run? Is that within the security context, right? All of those things were sort of already figured out by a cloud provider that has a whole bunch of permissioning around shared systems, right? So that's an interesting problem, and it introduces another problem, which is as soon as you introduce AI agents into the mix, which are massive productivity improvements, whether you're using it for coding or other things, you've now extended that vulnerability massively, right? In terms of like what those agents could get access to, what are they doing with your proprietary data? How do you control that? How do you monitor that? And this actually, frankly, is the entire area of responsible AI. Is like, what is the AI doing in the context of what I've asked it to do, and how do I monitor that? That is basically like if you look at a responsible AI team at Microsoft, that's effectively what they're doing internally, right? They're like, I know I need these things to help. I know it helps me scale, but I also have to have some governance and control around that. So that's sort of like the enterprise context of the problem. If you move that into the pure, like decentralized Web3 world, you have the same types of problems. And they're exacerbated because typically in a Web3 world, you don't have the same sort of permissioned governance, right? And so that raises the bar of how you have to be thoughtful about what are we doing when we register all these AI agents and we set them off on work to do on our behalfs? Like, where are the boundaries? How do we control that? How are we thinking about that? What AI models are they using? What leakage of my data into AI models is happening through those agents? There's all kinds of security landscape that gets introduced there that I think most people in the Web3 space have maybe not thought about, right? Because it's new to them, right? From a tooling perspective.
Absolutely. And I think it's a perfect segue to this next question. So you've introduced all of these new risks, but yes, of course, you're going to take advantage of these productivity tools, in a safe way. So in large organizations such as Microsoft, engineering and security teams often do have to balance ideas like product velocity with, yes, robust security defenses. So from your experience, are there principles or kind of trade-offs that Web3 builders could borrow from more mature security cultures to improve their resilience without slowing innovation? How do you recommend that they actually tackle this challenging convergence of,
Yeah.
security and AI productivity?
I mean, so like very publicly, Microsoft, as an example, has a security first principle, right? And that basically says you can't be trustworthy as a brand unless you are security first, right, on behalf of your customers, right? And those customers don't just include consumers, they include large enterprises, they include you know, nation state governments, right? So there's a whole landscape of different trust vectors there as well. And so, you use the word velocity. Unfortunately, that often is a hindrance to velocity, right? And so you have to make that decision, right? What is your principle, and how do you make sure that you stick by it in everything that you're doing? And Microsoft's very clear on that. Like we struggle all the time internally with velocity because we have to go through the right security reviews and security principles in everything we do, and it's checked regularly, right? It's not something that is off, right? And some of the posture changes, right, over time based on the threat landscape as well. So you might have gotten something to production that now has a new security vulnerability, right? That got flagged, right, in a security audit, which is happening somewhat regularly. And so that same problem exists. I mean, and I think if you could do probably very easy 5 to 10 case studies in the Web3 space where putting aside the fraudulent actors that might be opportunistic in the way they design their system. But you could look at the failures at the governance level, right, and the security level above the core protocols that didn't suffer. And just it's obvious, right? People went too fast without considering the necessary things that need to be considered in the context of whether it's an exchange or a bridge or whatever, right? And so startups like to go fast, right? I get it, right? But when you don't have governance and controls, you wind up with all kinds of examples that are very easy to name off the top of your head, right?
And I think that's an interesting piece too, because when we're talking about kind of governance and controls in the context of Web3, in comparison to, these well-known, reputable, kind of older organizations like Microsoft or other folks that are, getting into blockchain who already have these kind of strong governance and risk postures and perspectives, blockchain is relatively nascent. Kind of the space as a whole, it doesn't have these incredibly strong standards. And so there kind of becomes this divergence between trust and credibility coming from, brand and reputation versus it coming from verifiable security. So today in kind of blockchain-based systems, where do you see that? How much of this trust and credibility do you believe comes from that brand and reputation versus actual provable security measures? And maybe to add on to that, where do you see it going? Where is it today, and where might
Uh,
it be next?
yeah, it has to go to verifiable, right? Like the reliance on trusted brands has massive vulnerabilities, in my opinion. And notwithstanding, like if you have a brand who's controlling assets, that brand is an attack surface, right? And that attack surfaces can be, cyber attacks, they can be legal attacks, they can be all kinds of things, right? And so if you're dealing with proprietary or sensitive or valuable assets or data, you as a brand are a target, period, right? I mean, if you go back 15 years and look at the types of hacks that happened on major brands like Target.com and others, those were because they had honeypots of consumer data, right? And so they became the attack surface for where the consumer data lives. It's no different today. I think it's exacerbated because of the geopolitical environment that we're in, but you have to have verifiability. And so what Microsoft does is it looks at like what is the source of the code in a tech stack, right? And does those types of audits, and verifiability of the code in a tech stack is one of the ways that you protect the tech stack, right? And so I think we're moving very much to a world where verifiability is critical infrastructure for both software, Web3, non-Web3, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the types of approaches are different. Like some people rely on TEEs more, right? Some people are looking at the opportunities with zero knowledge. Obviously, everyone who's thinking, more than a couple of years out is looking at post-quantum cryptography at the foundational level to support the growing threat of that power as well.
You're obviously a fan of AI. You're always looking at ways that you can kind of work it into what you're building, but with controls and governance and security and risk in mind. From a purely security standpoint, where do you think, using AI in security does make sense versus where it doesn't?
Well, I think so broadly, I think that AI is useful as an extension, right? And it's an extension to your own intellect in a way that you don't want to give up your authority, right? And one of the ways you give up your authority is just assuming something's right, right? And that's, by the way, that's going to be a huge challenge, right? I'll come back to that in a minute. But so if you look at it from that perspective, I mean, look at the statistics on coding today, right? Like there's massive productivity gains in code systems that really help the productivity of developers and also make development possible that was harder by non-developers, right? And so those are just massive opportunities. And that's no different in the security space, but some of the fundamentals that are, well, like thinking through the problems, AI won't necessarily, unless you really push it, won't think through the problems in a way that you want it to think through the problem unless you actually have the knowledge to direct it in that way, right? I always tell people that like, in a very simplistic way, AI is no different than it's a neural network, right? So it's no different, and it was modeled after our brains. And we all in different stages of our lives, and with different afflictions, have difficulty remembering some things, but the data is there, right? AI is the same way, right? And so if you can't instruct AI to draw on the things that you know it needs and that you would draw on in your own brain, because if you don't have that knowledge, right, then you'll have massive gaps in the answers that you get back. It's very easy to see this between simplistic, short answer, quick results chats, right, that like chat interfaces for AI were designed for really consumer response times, like 3 seconds, versus deep reasoning where you get, a 10-minute response or a 20-minute response. And the deep reasoning is better, but it's not better if you don't direct it in the right way. And I have a lot of examples that I've worked on with my students in how do we use AI to help do academic research and ask, the questions that haven't been asked in a particular domain. It does require some domain knowledge, right, to know what are good references and what are bad references, right? And so, I mean, an interesting example, because we're working through this with some of the stuff that we published, is we were recently trying to push to make sure that we get to source references about a complicated topic. And we're using reasoning models. And the model came, and we've been trying both OpenAI as well as Anthropic, because we can switch out the models, obviously, that do the reasoning. And what we found was, in one particular example, was we were getting references that had the source link in them, but actually it was pulling the articles about the source link and not the actual source link, which doesn't really help, right? Because the article is a summary already, right? And it's kind of odd that the articles all had the source link, and what I really wanted was the source link reference, right? So that's just an example. How would you even know that, right? Unless you have some domain knowledge. And like, if you're doing an economic study, what are reputable sources for economic study, right? How do you know that? So there's a lot of landscape there. I think the bigger existential problem that we're going to very quickly run into is clearly, and I have multiple colleagues who are, basically working essentially in a full context of they're the orchestrator for AI workloads, where they're running sort of AI shifts like every 5 hours effectively. And that's based on a quota. But what it means is that, like, if you think about that cycle, it is come up with the problem that I need to solve in this 5 hour period, let the system go run and exhaust its quota, go and review all the things that it output, right, before the next 5 hour quota starts. So I can then also plan the next 5 hours of work, right? And so that kind of tells you the problem that I'm about to go after, which is if you don't have the time to review the work, how do you know what's going on, right? And I think that's going to happen, especially with agents. And so the example I just used is a good one that's doing it with good governance, right? But you could do it without good governance, and you'd wind up with a system that you have no idea how it was built, which is, I think, on major enterprise systems is obviously an issue. On quick spin-up websites is not so much of an issue, right? Unless it's involving security and assets and things like that.
Very interesting. It gets into a topic that has been a kind of recurring theme in these interviews that I've been doing with, blockchain specialists, security specialists from across crypto native and kind of, now TradFi moving into blockchain or kind of just Web2 in general moving into Web3, that the AI is only as good as the human in the loop. And
Mhm.
and therefore that's exactly what you're speaking to. Like it is an augmentation of your capabilities, is not a replacement of your capabilities. And so to tie it back to something we spoke about a few minutes ago, which was this concept of verifiability and that we need to move into verifiability and security. Do you see AI as something that can take us to verifiability or
Yeah.
yeah, how do you navigate verifiability?
So I think, yeah. So I do think that things like, so what gives you verifiability in development? One of the things that gives you verifiability is test cases, right? And so if you've done a really, really good job on test cases, a thoughtful job on test cases, then you actually have a way to augment test case production, edge case, and all the things that you'd want to look for through an AI workload, essentially. So that opportunity is absolutely there. And what we typically see in situations like that, or in a responsible AI situation, is you do have secondary agents, right, running test cases against the code as it's being developed. And so Dr. Sarah Bird, actually, who runs responsible AI at Microsoft, spoke about this a couple semesters ago at the Ethical Tech Summit that I hold. And she basically said, like, we can do things in code in real time now during development that we could never do before with human beings. And so that's actually massive value case, but it does require the right sort of guidance, right, to do it. I was actually very pleased with some of the details that she shared, willingly, openly about that work as well.
Very interesting. Okay, the final course, the last question we always ask the experts that join us here is, what is your security hot take? What do you think, people are still getting wrong when it comes to security, especially in digital assets or in blockchain?
Yeah, I think I would maybe on both sides of the question. I think the vulnerability of systems design where improper governance, because it's not understood by people who are less familiar, um, is huge. And I think in a lot of cases, if you're not coming from the Web3 space, your assumptions about trust and security are very different. And so if you're trying to design something new, a new blockchain, a new piece of infrastructure, your trust assumptions will just be fundamentally different, right? And that is contextual learning that just takes people time to get to. And often, if you think about the statement I just made, which is, you've got decades of assumptions about trust and security that now are fundamentally different. And how do people navigate that? It has a lot to do with, many other things like incumbents, intermediaries, right? Like and business models as well. So there's also just a natural reluctance to try to take on this new shift, or think that you can do it the old way. And I think that's a huge risk. It's a huge risk in anyone new coming into the blockchain and the Web3 space, and I think frankly also the AI space as it converges. And then secondly, I think on the opportunistic side, obviously the work that's been going on, including in Microsoft Research, in zero knowledge for verifiability, is amazing, right? And like the speed that we've seen in the evolution of proving times and models and recursion approaches and things like that over the last 10 years has been astounding in terms of moving that cryptographic approach forward. I do think that in any cryptographic security mechanism, as you're well aware, there is a life, right? Which is also why people are looking at post-quantum security, because it is a threat to the existing types of encryption mechanisms. So, choosing the right models to be quantum secure is really important now. And we see a lot of that work going on, both in traditional enterprise systems as well as in Web3 and blockchain systems. And so I think we have the tools, right, for verifiability. But we need to ensure that people understand what are the governance requirements plus the tools that get you to the assumptions that you're trying to get to, and trust assumptions when you have shared infrastructure across multiple parties.